I hope you're doing well. Of course, I'd like to thank you so very much for joining me today. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 3, Paul writes, "But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity and purity that is in Christ." He says, for if he who comes preaches another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it. Paul says, I fear that someone is going to come in and deceive you. He says, I fear that someone is going to preach a different Jesus to you, one that we have not preached. He says, I fear that someone will bring a spirit into the churches that we have not brought, one that you have not received from us. He says, I fear that someone will preach to you a different gospel that we have not preached, that you have not accepted. Paul says, I fear these things, that someone is going to come in and that you, Corinthians, will put up with it. So it makes sense, if Paul has that concern about the Corinthians, that he would write to the Galatians in the first chapter in verse 8, but even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. Paul writes, if someone comes in and preaches a gospel that we have not preached, if someone comes in and preaches a gospel, preaches a message that is not from God's inspired word, let him be accursed. Why is it so important to you, Paul? Why do you put so harsh punishment or such harsh language on it, Paul? Why is that important? It's because a false gospel is no gospel at all. Let me say that again. A false gospel is no gospel at all. And that's the problem that we see in so many different churches today. Yes, they were once built on the gospel. Yes, they were once built on the Bible, on God's holy word. But then after a while, as the congregation changes, as the people change, they might find themselves looking for a different gospel, one that suits them. And I'll remind the viewer that the gospel is not supposed to suit you. You are supposed to suit the gospel. We see that in Philippians chapter 1, verses 27 and following. But the gospel is not meant to suit us, but oftentimes people will make it seem that way. They'll make it appeal to us and say, well, look, it suits you better. It's better for this age. It's better for this time. It's better for these people. Paul says, let that person be accursed. Why, Paul? Because they're preaching another gospel. He says, Corinthians, I fear that you will put up with it. So you, today, this week, this month, no matter when it is that you're watching this, no matter what situation you might find yourself in, don't look for another gospel, and certainly don't put up with another one, because again, a false gospel, one that is not true, is no gospel at all. It is not God's good news. It is something that man has come up with. And again, I'll say that's the problem with so many places, so many congregations, and even people today, is that they're looking for another gospel. If they're not looking for it, maybe it's found them and they've put up with it. The message today, don't put up with those things. Stick to this, nothing else. I'd like to thank you so very much for watching. Thank you for joining me today, and I certainly hope to see you next time.